we bring so much of our own experiences, our scripts, into the here and now when we work with the learners. And likewise, they bring their own scripts in learning and in life into the learning space when they interact with us.
I think we're still really figuring out the importance of our experience of schooling, not only on what's going on for the learner in the room, but also for what's going on for me as the educator in the room.
This is the Transactional Analysis Podcast. Conversations on the theory, application, and spirit of TA, sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. In this episode, our conversation is with Jr-Earn Lam, a provisional teaching and supervising transactional analyst in the educational field. We discuss the concepts of homonymy and autonomy, as well as the educator-learner dynamic and the importance of holding power lightly as an educator and creating a space for open dialogue and shared learning, as well as the place of playfulness, curiosity, and being present-centered. We hope you enjoy.
Wow, I am delighted today to welcome Jr-Earn Lam to be talking to us on the Transactional Analysis Podcast. Welcome.
I'm really chuffed to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're really chuffed to have you, Anne.
Absolutely.
So, perhaps we can start today with you just telling us a little bit about yourself and where you are in the world and what you do.
Okay, so I am Singaporean, Chinese. I come from Singapore, where I live and I work, and I'm an adult educator. So I have a day job where I am director learning of a leadership consulting firm. We work in the leadership space in terms of consulting. We do coaching, and I also design and deliver adult learning programs for leaders, corporate leaders. And that's where a lot of my TA is used, because our firm, the work that we do is all based on TA.
Wonderful. And in terms of transaction analysis, when did you first come across it?
Okay, so I consider myself a TA child, like a second generational TA child, because my mother has been involved with TA. She doesn't have like formal TA qualifications. Mm-hmm. Oh, at which point I should also add, and I am a PTSTA in the educational field.
Important point.
Important point. And so Mom was actually instrumental in bringing TA into the organization where she worked for almost 40 years, and that's Singapore Airlines. And because she discovered TA as a really effective way of helping people understand themselves sort of in the work context. So I grew up with TA sort of around the home. And it was not until something like 17 years ago where I sort of decided, the stuff that Mom is always talking about, maybe I should, go and find out a little bit more. When I did my CTA exams, I actually went through my certificates. I had 3 different TA 101 certificates.
Did you really?
All from your mum?
Not from Mom, because mom doesn't have the formal qualifications. But what happened was, every time there was a TA 101 and she would say, oh, why don't you come along? And I would, right? But it took me a while for me to sort of discover TA for myself.
How old were you when you first did your first TA 101?
No, I wasn't that young. I would have been easily in my early 20s.
What I was curious about, before we get into, in one sense, what you've discovered about transaction analysis for yourself, I'm curious about, with what you now know about transaction analysis, what's your sense of what impact it had having a mother who was well informed about transaction analysis as you were growing up?
So I think this is really interesting, because if you think about it from the ego states, I have a really high rebellious child. And so I think what happened with having Mom, the big power in my life, right? The parental figure saying, oh, this is great, and go for this 101, come and check this out. There was a deep part of me that sort of rebelled against it. I went along in compliance, good compliant child, and went along, but there was also the resistance of, and this is not for me. This is Mom's stuff. And I think it made sense only when I clicked an adult that it really became something for me. And the impetus behind that was really when I was making a career transition into the work that I'm doing now. and sort of then saying, well, what's a good underpinning theory for the work that I want to do or that my sister and I want to do? And then when coming back to TA for myself on my own terms in the adult, and I mean, admittedly, when you first start your TA journey, there's not very much adult capacity for adult, right? But I think enough of it stuck to say, hey, this is interesting. Let me not just look at this as a theory. Let me look at this as something for myself.
And what has it meant to you as you have come to learn about it and absorb it for yourself? You know, the more you've used it, the more you've learned about it. What does TA mean to you?
TA is an opportunity for doing better.
Love that.
For me, it's so hopeful. I think for anyone who's doing TA for themselves, the idea of physis, the idea of autonomy, being open and able to say, I can grow my capacity for adults so that I can be more in the here and now and be more, in a sense, almost in control of how I respond to what's going on around me and be a better version of myself. That's what I really like about TA.
Can I ask you, this is a stretch now for your teacher role, you mentioned the word physis, and it's a word that doesn't seem to appear in many other theories, psychosocial models. So it's this idea in TA, and I wondered if you could maybe explain to listeners who haven't heard of physis and what it might be. What does physis mean to you?
There's probably a technical definition out there. However, for me, the way I view it is an expansion and updating of the adult. That growth, unlike Keith Tudor's integrating adult model. And that when you say physis, that's what I mean. The sort of ever expanding, ever updating, of that adult ego state and that continuous circle. So that's my Jr-Earn Lam definition of physis.
Love it. Great. Thank you.
Beautiful. And I mean, I like that work of Tudor's as well, because it feels like with their ego state model, I think sometimes we can get to the point where it sounds like, the adult is all the everything and actually parent and child are bad and we shouldn't be there. And what I love about the integrating model is it's this idea that actually you pull in from the parent and the child what's useful to you. Some of that spirit of rebellion can be really important in our lives, but also sometimes we need that more parental idea of actually where are the boundaries or where does the care need to be. So it's pulling in what's useful and leaving what's outdated and no longer useful to us behind, with that sort of integrating, sort of pulsating process.
Definitely. And for me, it's, that's the power of TA. It's about being able to update stuff that's either from a big power in your parent or from your own experiences in the child, and not throwing it away, not saying these things are horrible and, archaic, but really just updating it and saying, let's check it out. And I personally found that that's been my journey in TA, checking things out. And even now, right, as a TA practitioner, just checking out my own understanding of TA theory in terms of how it helps me as an educator or how it helps my team of educators, and saying, hey, when I first learned this was how I interpreted it. And maybe in the culture that I'm working in, right, in Singapore, or if I'm working with other cultures, what does it mean to make it my own? What does it mean to allow them to make it their own? And that again, for me, is that updating, right?
I'm really curious to know more about that, Ern, in terms of what's your sense of TA as you've explored it in relation to the culture that you learned within and you grew up within, and how that's now informing your practice as an educator.
I think it's a work in progress. So I'll give you where I am right now. I think in the Asian culture, especially in Singapore, I want to qualify that I will speak from my own experience as a Chinese Singaporean, because I'm sort of not very keen to speak for all of Singapore. I have a tendency to learn first in compliance. And that's my educational heritage, right? There's a very strong liberal sort of educational sort of background, and even dogmatic, right, wrong, you do as the teacher says. And so I'm quite certain that when I first started learning TA, there was a fair amount of that, right? Even with sort of the exploring. Now, as I'm growing in TA, then the question is, what's considered okay in TA? Or even just the concept of okayness in TA. Is it different for different people of different cultures? Like, what is okayness in Singapore for me as an Asian person or Asian Chinese, Singaporean Chinese? Could it be slightly different for, say, you guys? Given that, the cultural frame in which we both live. So that's been my exploration. So making TA my own has, now that I'm a PTSTA, there's a little bit about the identity phase where you kind of just go, okay, so who am I as a TA practitioner? And just saying, let's test some of these things that I've learned earlier as a trainee and test this against my cultural norms and say, well, maybe the okayness is a little bit different.
I was going to say, I'm really curious about what insights you may have gathered and what has emerged for you, having been raised in a very different culture from that where the theory emerged from, California in the 60s, and has developed from there. And I wonder if there was anything particularly striking for you that like a headline that has been most clearly different in the cultural approaches.
There are a couple. So the first is about homonomy and autonomy. And in my culture, we have a very strong focus on the group, the social setting, the family, your elders. Summers and Tudor, they mentioned that, homonomy, and that actually homonomy does resonate with a lot of Asian cultures, right? So that's one. And I've also wondered, in that particular bucket, what positives or what strengths my culture has around homonomy. So that's the first one. The second one is about learning and the educator-learner relationship in learning. Because in my culture, so we all know, well, adult interactions are great. That's the gold standard, right? And parent-child sort of educator-learner dynamic, that's the one to be careful about. Now, in Mandarin, there's actually a saying that I hold quite dearly. It's 一日为师，终身为父. And translated, that means a day as a teacher, a lifetime as a father. And it encapsulates the respect that we give to the role of the teacher.
So it's not just somebody who's briefly involved in your life to sort of educate you about something, but they take this more paternalistic figure for you throughout your life. That's what I'm hearing within this.
Yeah. And sometimes if you were to translate it into English, then straight away you might have alarm bells, right? You might be, oh no, but that's not healthy, and it invites compliance and invites adaptation. And yet for me, in the phrase in Mandarin suggests something different as well. There's a positive side to that, a care, a structure. I use the word reverence, and I use it with some care because I know reverence might also set off some alarm bells, like, oh no, guru, right? And so I'm wondering whether there is maybe some positive aspects of the parent-child dynamic in educator-learner that maybe we can explore, right? That is slightly different in my culture, that may actually be healthy and effective in helping people learn.
The phrase that comes to my mind the more you talk about that saying is eldership. There's something about the elder who has knowledge and wisdom to share, and the knowledge and the wisdom to know how to share it in a way that encourages the other rather than oppresses the other, which I guess is the danger for us sometimes as educators, is when that parent-child dynamic becomes oppressive and it becomes about me being the all-powerful educator who's going to tell you what you need to learn, rather than me as the educator using all of my ego states to be able to facilitate and support whatever it is that the student or the adult in my training room wants to learn and wants to find out. So I wonder if that notion of eldership might have something to say around this.
Yeah, I love the idea of eldership. And I take the fact that the parent-child dynamic does come naturally with all the sort of normal downsides that we are so aware of in learning. So that's for me the question, right? What strengths do we have in my culture around eldership, around the role that we can harness as an educator?
What would you say you harness as an educator then? What aspects of eldership would you say that you harness when you're delivering these training workshops? I was just thinking about, you were saying co-creative TA, and how one of the philosophical underpinnings is the idea of shared responsibility, but not equal responsibility. And so I was just thinking about that. There's obviously a power dynamic, but it sounded like you hold that in a way that's very inclusive and aware, present.
That's a really good question. I think it's about how we hold the power as educators. And for me, I tend to hold the power lightly. I know that there is an importance of the awareness that I have. So the awareness of that power, I think, is important for me. And I remember one aha moment when I looked in the group, and I remember thinking how I hold this group is going to make a big difference in how they work or they work with me. And that was my aha moment when I was working with a group of bankers, actually. So being aware of the power dynamics for me is one, and then holding it lightly for me is another. To say, I don't have all the answers, and I really would like to hear from you. And it's something I do say when I lead a program. If a question comes up, okay, so in my culture, if a question comes up, they look to you for the answers, right? Because there's a parent-child dynamic, and you're the expert. And I've taken to saying, I do have an opinion, and I will share my opinion. I promise you that. And first, I'd like to know what everyone else thinks. So the first time I say it to a group, usually they go, whoa,
What just happened here?
you can see. Although I think by the time I say that to a group, they've probably interacted enough with me to kind of know that I'm sort of a little bit different from their usual trainers. I'm a little bit off the wall. So, and I bring that into my learning space, right? And I think they kind of figured that out. But the subsequent times I say it, you can see that it really settles. And then the way that people respond is different. And I've had the privilege of, listening to their responses. It's also similar to something else I do say, which is that I don't have the answers necessarily. And I try to say that early on in the group as well. And that just brings the dynamic ever so closer.
And is it sort of bringing that dynamic more towards the adult to adult sort of space to disrupt the potential for that parent-child dynamic by declaring early on, I don't have all the answers, and I'm interested in you, that it's one way of disrupting that dynamic that we can so easily slip into, particularly if our educational experience as children was very much, as you say, that liberal model of the parent-teacher figure telling me, the child figure or student, what it is I need to know.
Very much so. And so I use it intentionally, particularly if I sense early on in the group that there's if I sense the group imago is really one where they're looking to me as the sort of the teacher. And, at the end of the day, I don't think that I fully move away from the parent-child dynamic. And I think what I'm giving them is maybe a different sort of parent-child dynamic. I'm not sure we always go into adult a lot. And so it's again coming back to exploring whether there can be a different sort of parent-child dynamic sometimes that updates their idea that, okay, an educator can be authority, and it doesn't have to be like the way I used to experience it.
I can also hear the echoes of your rebellious child in the way you talk about yourself being a little bit off the wall and a bit different, that actually maybe there's some making healthy use of that child-to-child playfulness, which can be a way of inviting something different into the room about, let's play with this. Let's see what we think. Not just what I think, but what do we think? That the sort of co-creative, as Matt says, shared responsibility is not equal.
Actually, there was a learning around that in my CTA training process. So I think I started off really from the rebellious child and maybe even anti-script to say, I really hated that. We're going completely polar opposite, right? Let's bring on the fun, bring on the laughter. And I think that's how I began. And as I grew in TA, then I updated that and sort of thought about myself and saying, hang on, how much of this is real fun, and how much of this is just you pushing back?
That's so interesting that you use that word, because that's exactly what I was about to say, that though you are disrupting in some ways their idea of what education is, especially adult education, that it seems to be that you're exploring what's effective. So if there is an effective way of working with that parent-child dynamic and the familiarity of that feel from somebody's history, it may be too much, too overwhelming, become ineffective if it's too different from what someone's experienced initially. So, not stretching them beyond their capacity to be in the optimal space for learning, I guess.
And I wonder again whether culture comes in here. And I don't want to use culture as the sort of the excuse for everything, but I sort of also wondered if, Jack Mezirow and the disorientating dilemma about radical learning and all of that, and like being confronting the adult in the learning space, exactly like you say, Matt, I wondered whether or not breaking the mold too drastically in my kind of culture, where I interpret my culture as being rather anti-confrontation, right? And so therefore, open sort of, disruption can be hard and it can be difficult for learners. And so it comes from that space. It also comes from a place of wondering whether there is something healthy, like I said earlier, in the cultural appreciation of the elder. That maybe I don't have to always be adult. Maybe I can explore or maybe provide a different perspective of what could be a healthy parent-child and learning. I'm not sure. I don't have the answers. And I know there are a lot of people out there who think you only learn in the adult. And if you're not learning in the adult, you're not really learning. So, I say this with some caution. And I say this from an exploration of whether there can be effective aspects of that dynamic.
Fascinating. My training is in psychotherapy, and it makes me think of the many different schools in psychotherapy and how there are ways to be effective in all of them. And that's one of the things I actually love about TA. It's something you said right at the beginning is you were looking for an underpinning theory. And the thing that I really love about TA is there's so many ideas that we can explore, and we can explore them in a very practical way and run experiments, if you like, to see what is, as you said before, what is effective.
I was curious, what of the TA models or theories are particular favourites of yours that in one sense help you to explore that dynamic and think about actually, how do I teach effectively? How do I enable my learners to learn effectively? How do I learn effectively whilst I'm teaching? Are there any go-to models for you?
So the first article from the TAJ that really impacted me as an educator was the one by Jr-Earn Lam, the synergistic use of 5 TA concepts in education, all by educators. That was my first big, oh wow, this really works for me. And I find the integrating adult really helpful for me in just saying, it's about updating. Let's have different experiences. It's about the 5 Ps that Jr-Earn Lam writes about frames of reference. So those are some of the ones. More recently, what's really impacted me is a diagram that Trudy Newton came up with in an article that's published in French. She wrote an article about relational learning, and Trudy was my supervisor for my written exam. And so during that period, that was how I got to know about this article. She sent me the English version of this article. She writes about relational learning, which really, really resonates with me. In particular, she adapts a diagram from Susan Mazzetti, and it's a diagram of the learner and the educator. Although I think in original version, it was, the therapist and the the client. And it's about how we have our life scripts, the back there and then, both of us, the educator and the learner. And we also have the here and now that we're experiencing together. And the diagram actually says, this part, the boundaries are really in the here and now, and they are impacted by the back there and then that both parties bring into the learning space. And that's really my go-to model right now, because we bring so much of our own experiences, our scripts, into the here and now when we work with the learners. And likewise, they bring their own scripts in learning and in life into the learning space when they interact with us.
Yeah. And I think there's something that certainly for me also working as an educator, I think we're still really figuring out the importance of our experience of schooling, not only on what's going on for the learner in the room, but also for what's going on for me as the educator in the room. Ways in which I step into the role of the teacher if I'm not aware, if I'm not grounded in the here and now, and how that can then invite the unhelpful parent-child dynamic into the room without thinking about it, and really understanding how that impacts me as an educator as much as the learner's experience of schooling is impacting rather their experience of the education they're receiving in that moment. And whether or not they're able to, if I'm offering something that's a bit disruptive, whether or not they're immediately able to accept it, or whether actually they might start to resist it.
Actually, this is one of my big things right now, and I'm working on ideas around it. I have a hypothesis around it, exactly like you say, Sarah, about how it shows up as educators. Because the continuum that Giles writes about in that article about schooling and script, schooling, learning and script.
You mean the learning continuum, which is looking at various different ways of educating, moving from sort of dogmatic, liberal, through humanistic, progressive, through to the radical at the far end.
Bless you. Yes. And Trudy and Rosemary Napper write about it in their book on tactics, right? About how that it shows up in the different contracts that we have and the imagos. And part of my job is about working with my faculty. So I have a small team of faculty. And sometimes when I meet potential trainers, they will say, I believe in teaching in a certain way. I believe in being facilitators, because now the trend is I want to be progressive, and if I can, I want to be radical, right? And everybody says that. A lot of the trainers I meet back home here say I'm very facilitative, and it's really more progressive that they say they are. But when I see them in action, really they're not, right? We're not actually what we think we are in our heads. And so I've been asking myself that question: what accounts for that? And my suspicion is that it's the script, the scripts that we have as educators in terms of our experiences of learning. And if we're not aware of it too much, then what happens is we think we're doing something and we're trying to achieve a certain outcome, or we're trying to, work a certain way. And actually it's coming out differently. I tell my trainers, for example, you can ask questions, because, key thing is ask open-ended questions, and then you will invite engagement and interaction and all that good stuff. And of course, it changes the dynamics. And yet, how you ask a question, I mean, you could even, it's like, you can even write out the open-ended question, but how the educator asks that question can actually be very different. You can actually ask an open-ended question in a very didactic way. And so my hypothesis is that if you have these bits in your formative experiences, not as an educator, maybe as a learner, right? Help build that frame, like in that diagram I was describing to you about, the back there and then affects our here and now and how we show up. And so we may not be aware that we are showing up differently than what we want to be.
That makes me reflect on my sort of early experience of, I work both as a coach one-to-one, but also I would say a facilitator of developmental programs in organizations. And I know when I was first doing that in my late 20s, early 30s, long before I knew about transactional analysis, I think I experienced a lot of internal anxiety about not knowing the answers to the question. What if somebody's going to ask me a question that I cannot answer? Going back to what you were talking about sometimes earlier about using humor to sort of get yourself out of a sticky situation. I mean, I originally trained as an actress, and that's got me a little bit of performance. It's got me out of many a sort of dicey situation. And it's making me reflect. And I think what TA enabled me to do was to settle into being myself more, not performing like the educator I thought I ought to be because of the educators in my script. You know, some of whom were very good, some of whom perhaps were less than helpful as role models, allowing me to be in the room as the educator, knowing what I know and knowing that won't be the answer to everything, and being okay with that, to allow some of that panic, that fear, that what people might refer to as imposter thinking, you know, today is going to be the day that I'm found out that I can't actually do this. Those parts of my script are still there on occasions and at times, you know, particularly the first session with a new group. But I think my understanding of what transactional analysis has taught me about relational dynamics has really enabled me to think it's okay for me to turn up today as I am with what I know and meet these people as they are with what they know, and see what we can sort of learn together in the room together, which took me a while to be able to let go of that structure. And as I say, it still informs it, but it feels potent at a much more grounded, rooted sort of adult level, rather than trying to fight for supremacy, which is, I think, what certainly for me, my older script dynamic seems to be luring me towards. That if I'm the educator, I'm in charge and I'm in control in that old script.
I really like the word used just now, performer. So one of the things that I was concerned about, or I learned about bringing fun and laughter into the programs, was this thing about edutainment, right? Where you kind of go in with jazz hands and you're like, you're going to have a good time. And originally with the notion of, I want to disrupt learning. And yeah, so I really like the term you used. I thought that was a really significant term, performing. And I wondered whether the performance is, for different ones of us, I think it's different. And I think sometimes maybe performance is about performing, maybe role-playing or reenacting the teacher figures in our head, the big powers of teachers in our heads. So I really, really like that term, Sarah. Thank you for using it.
Instinctive, I guess, for me with a performance background. And I think certainly for me, the performance was necessary in order for me to feel okay in the room. It's almost like a mask. As you say, a role play, you know, we step into playing a role. You know, we learn children to try on things for size, and playing teachers was one of my favourite games as a child. You know, I'd spent hours coming up with a register to mark everybody off, you know, in the room where it's me at my dad's desk and an empty dining table in front of me with all the paperwork laid out. I spent so long setting the game up, there wasn't actually time for me to play it. But I think there is something about stepping into the role. So I think in some of my early training, people had a lot of fun, whether they learned what they were, you know, needed to learn, or whether we got through everything that I was supposedly meant to cover off. That might be, you know, a little bit more contentious, but I needed that performance to get into the room.
I totally can relate to that. And yes, I can relate to that very much from my earlier years in being an adult educator and being a TA practitioner as well. Yeah, totally.
I guess for me, what I'm hearing you both talking about is how there is a really strong unconscious pull that we go into our script. The information in our parent and child ego states are the go-tos when we're under stress. So when you're in stressful situations, those ego states get energized or cathected. And as you were saying earlier, holding the integrating adult and noticing, being aware and present. There are times when it is so stressful, that's all we have to rely on, or where we're under such demand. What I wanted to ask was, what have been the best moments for you whilst using TA? Are there any kind of highlights, aha moments for either yourself or something you've seen in the teams that you've been teaching, where you could give us an example of you using TA and just absolutely loving the experience, or feeling like, God, this is fantastic? What are the highlights for you?
Well, the first one was that experience I shared earlier about, being in front of a group of bankers, and it was an international group as well. So I was particularly sort of anxious because there were not only bankers, they were like, I had Europeans, I had people from China, I had people from Korea and Japan, and it was an international group. And that aha moment of just knowing that there is a group imago and I can hold it. Mm. And for me, the phrase that came was, and I am enough. I'm good enough. The potency of just knowing that I have enough. A little bit like what Sarah said just now, right? Just dealing with that and being centered and there. So that was my first aha moment. I have another aha moment that I love from working with one of my team members. And he's a lovely guy. And we were sort of talking about his interaction with a bunch of learners. He has very senior corporate experience. And he was working with a group of supervisors. So, there's a big gap between his corporate experience and the learners that he's working with. And we were talking about the parent-child dynamic, as we were talking about just now. And he says, so how do I ask questions that don't sound like I'm being directive? Because we were exploring the parent-child dynamics, even in that we were debriefing it, processing it in that way. And I had a good laugh. We had a good laugh. And I said, try just being curious. And he said, okay, that's it. And I said, yes. And try really wanting to hear what they have to say. And so really inviting their voice and their adults into the room. And it was really sweet because for weeks after that, he went around telling all our team, Karen says, just be curious. So that's my thing for the season. I'm going to be curious.
Brilliant.
And for me, that story is about curiosity. For me, sits with the child ego state. It's for me as the educator to bring my child into the room and just be curious about what it is that they understand, what it is that they know, and what might I learn from that. It's the thing I think that's beautifully disruptive around the co-creative stuff is that not just it's a shared responsibility, and we're all responsible for the learning in the room, maybe in different ways, and we'll all learn from each other. I just wanted to say, as we bring this podcast, I'm rather sad to bring this podcast to a close because I think we could happily chat about this for some times, but to say not only have you been enough, I think you've been more than enough today in sharing with us your thinking, and your current thinking is about transactional analysis and it's how you're using it in your practice, but also what it's taught you today. And I'm deeply grateful to you for what you shared with us today. So thank you so much for being here with us.
No, and thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found the episode interesting, inspiring, and useful. We would really appreciate it if you left a review on the platform you are listening on. Our website has more information and resources at www.tapodcast.com. You can connect with us on all major platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can email us at info@tapodcast.com. This episode is sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. You can find more information about the ITAA at www.itāworld.com, and you can find more information about IATA at www.eatanews.org.